So thank you all for joining us today. I probably know some of you. I'm Paige. I'm one of the staff advisors here in the Psych Undergraduate Advising Office. And I'm really excited to introduce our speaker Becca today, who's going to tell you all a little bit about applying to clinical PhD programs. I know we get a lot of questions in our office about graduate school pathways, specifically ones in clinical. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to her. And thank you so much, Becca, for being here with us today.
Good. Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. My name is Becca. I am completing my clinical psychology PhD. Nice to e-meet all of you. I will share my screen because I put an about me slide in there also. Okay, so today I'm really just going to be talking about how to apply to grad school, things to think about as you're thinking about applying to clinical programs. It's way more complicated than it needs to be, so I figure it can be nice to have somebody to talk through some of the different nuances that are part of this. If you have any questions, I will definitely have plenty of time at the end. If there's anything that I've said that's like wildly unclear, you can feel free to stop me and let me know. But okay, about me. So I am currently on my psychology internship at Boston Children's Hospital. So what that means is at the end of your clinical psychology PhD or PsyD program, you do what is effectively like a med school residency for a year, and you do a year of clinical work, and you apply to a bunch of places, and you match somewhere via an algorithm. So I've been finishing up my training at Boston Children's, which has been really nice. And at the end of that, I will have my PhD in clinical psychology from Penn State, which is where I met Danny, which thanks, Danny. So about me is I do a mixture of research and clinical experiences. I throughout graduate school did research on child and adolescent social skills and peer rejection and interventions to help kids make friends, basically. So if you ever want to talk about friendship, hit me up. I will put my email somewhere. I haven't done here, but I will send it in the chat. And then clinically, I've done a lot of outpatient work, which is like kids coming in for therapy. And then on internship at Boston Children's, I've done a lot more of kids who are coming into the hospital for like medical stays and things like that. So happy to answer any questions about that. I'm primarily pursuing clinical work going forward. I'm still going to be part of research as part of academic medicine. But I found over the course of my time in grad school that I was really fulfilled by the clinical work. And so I'm mostly pursuing that on my postdoc and beyond. Okay. Is this? Oh, okay. This is a lot of text, so these are just a bunch of things to consider. So when we're thinking about, the first thing we need to think about is what kind of programs do we want to apply to? Because there are a lot of different options and a lot of degree options, and some of you might have heard all these different things about like a PhD or a PsyD or counseling programs or social work programs or things like that. So there are a lot of ways in which you can pursue a similar career path. They just have some slight and not slight differences as for what they entail, how long they are, what you can do with those degrees afterward. So, like a PhD, like I'm getting, it really prepares you for a research degree, but it also prepares you for clinical work in academic settings. It's typically 5 to 7 years long. So if you're willing to spend that much more time in school, great. But not everybody is, and you have to think about that for yourself because it makes total sense if you're actually like, hey, I think I would like to not sacrifice so many years of my life to be a student and to do this job because that would be super fair. A PsyD is also it's like a doctorate of psychology. It is relatively controversial as a degree, which some of you might have heard various things about it. There are some really reputable PsyD programs. They're a little more clinically focused. Um, The thing that is controversial about them is that there are some PsyD programs that are a little on the degree mill side, where you're not getting as good of training, but this is not to disparage PsyDs. You just have to be a little more careful when you are looking at the programs. And then for things like Masters of Social Work, Masters of Family Therapy, those types of degrees will prepare you for um, clinical work and systems-based work and not really doing the research, not doing assessment, keeping it much more in the therapy lane. So, like I said, choosing one of these programs will take some reflection of what you want your future career to be. First and foremost, especially if you're considering a PhD, do you like research? Because research is a major, major, major component of a PhD. And so if research is really makes you miserable, it is not worth it, in my opinion, to go get a PhD. Do you want to go into private practice? Because if private practice is your main goal, like I just want to be a therapist and I'm not just, but that's my main goal, then a master's degree could get you there in that same way of if you know very much that you want like a 2 or 3 year degree, you can do that. Financial constraints are important to consider for multiple reasons. Some of these programs, like PsyDs and the master's programs, can be quite expensive. Um, and so you have to think about, can you afford to go to these programs? And or are you willing to take on debt for some of these programs? Um, and even if a PhD, which should be funded, I don't recommend anybody goes to an unfunded PhD. Um, you're gonna make not very much money. And can you afford to live on something like $20,000 a year for 5+ years? So things to think about. Um, and then also, again, are you willing to spend a lot more time in school? Because it's totally cool if you're not. Um, okay. And then the area, I can talk about clinical more than anything, but there are other areas that allow you to do clinical work. So school psychology programs will often let you still work with kids if you want to work with kids in the schools. Counseling programs have clinical work that has a slightly different focus, I think, on the types of things you're counseling around and the types of problems that people come in with. And then things like developmental, social, cognitive, those are way more research and you're not going to get clinical work from those. So there are a lot of options and a lot of paths here, and they're just some of them. So next, to be a competitive PhD applicant, because that is what I can talk to. Research experience really, really is the most important thing to be able to get into a PhD program in clinical psychology. So again, if you hate research, don't do it. Don't put yourself through that. So if you can get research experience in undergrad, that's great. Even if you haven't some research experience in undergrad, my top recommendation is usually finding what's called a post-bac research assistant job. I don't know if anybody has looked at those, or I have no idea actually what years you guys are. But finding that type of research assistantship is, I think, super valuable because you get experience in a lab, you get paid for it, you get real world experience, and you're more likely to have more responsibilities in a lab that are transferable and prepare you for graduate training. Um, you can also do a research-based master's program if you want more research experience. Again, that's a financial consideration that you have to make because if you have the money, then it can be really good. I know people who that's worked out really well for, and there are other people who have gone mostly the job route. And then volunteering in a research lab. I put that in parentheses because and imagine folks are somewhat aware of all the uncertainty of funding of science in general. So I actually don't know in this climate today how difficult it is to find a paid research assistant job. Um, if you are unable to find one of those, volunteering in a research lab, I think, is your next best bet, in that labs still want people to help them. They still are looking for people to work and get research experience and help them with their studies, even if their grants don't have as much ability to pay you. But again, it's things to consider of, do you have another job where you can make money, and thinking of, unfortunately a lot of pieces to weigh here. To find some of those positions, there are some specific job boards for research assistant positions. I'm happy to share any of those if that can be helpful. There's some listservs, like emails, that will send you emails all day, every day, some relevant, some less, but they'll have some of those postings that you can apply to. Networking is always useful. And then when I was applying for these RAs, I did some cold emailing where I found a bunch of professors that looked really interesting to me. They didn't seem to have positions posted, but I emailed them essentially introducing myself, describing my interests and asking if they knew if they were taking any RAs or if they knew anybody who was. Um, and I got some responses that way. So people, while busy, I've found people in this field are nicer and relatively generous with their time and help. Okay. Okay, cool. Now, picking a program and picking places to apply is generally the next biggest thing. A PhD, as I said here, it's based on research fit, just no matter what area of, like, if you do PhD in counseling, PhD in school, PhD in clinical, it's all about research fit. So you can do some reflecting, and some of that research experience in undergrad and in that post-bac time can help you figure out what types of things you're interested in. So that could be areas like, there are anxiety research labs, there are depression research labs, there are the lab that I worked at when I was in between was a child and family policy center that was working on interventions to help at-risk youth. So there's a lot of different things that people specialize in, but you gotta figure out at least one area that feels interesting to you of what you would want to research. Then to pick people, you want to find PIs, which are essentially the advisors, and professors who publish and have projects in those areas. So you can do like a Google Scholar search, do some reading if there's any articles in any of your classes that have been particularly interesting. Finding those folks and looking up to see whether they're taking students is a good way to sort of curate your long list. I will say sometimes the websites are not clear of whether or not they're taking a student. Sometimes it's super clear and it's like, I am taking a student for 2026, 2027. And other times they're not updated and you have to do a little digging. In which case you can email professors usually to ask if they're taking a student if that's not clear. Now, 15 I know sounds like a lot and perhaps an arbitrary number, but it's important to have a lot to at least look into applying to, because again, not all of these people are taking students every year, especially in the current funding landscape where PhD programs are getting smaller. There's just not as much money to fund students. So you want to have a long list of options of people to apply to who seem interesting, who seem like work that you would be happy doing. And you don't have to apply to all of them, but having at least that many that you're considering, I think, is important, just so that you can have options. You can also think about location and quality of life. So, like, I spent the last 5 years in central Pennsylvania, and that was fine for me, but not everybody is into that. And so it's harder to curate programs based solely on location, but it's a thing you want to think about if you know that you will be absolutely miserable not in a city, then yeah, that helps you curate what kinds of programs you want to apply to because you don't want to apply to programs in the middle of nowhere, like say Penn State. Um, and quality of life, also looking at things like the stipends don't vary that much between programs, but knowing the cost of living and if you're going to be able to make it work, also just are just things that are useful. And then for grad school, looking beyond stereotypical prestige. So I know there's a lot of temptation to be like, and you might not, any of you might not feel this way, but a lot of temptation to oh, to think about like, oh, I want to go to the top 20 schools, I want to go to the Ivy League, I want to do all of this. That matters much less in graduate training. Those rankings are kind of even more arbitrary. So it's really about finding good fit programs more so than programs that sound really good because they're like an Ivy League or something like that. Ivy Leagues can still be great, but you want them to be a good fit more so than you want them to be like a super big prestigious name. Okay. Okay. So there are a bunch of steps to these applications. I'm going to talk about a couple of these in more detail, but this is overall just a bullet list of the types of things that are required for a clinical psychology application. Applications typically are due December 1st of a given year. Um, there can be a little bit of variation depending on the program. So pay attention to that, but chances are you will already know that and that will be clear. One thing that is not always taught is emailing the professors you're interested in. It's not a requirement, but it's kind of an unspoken requirement in that, like, it's not really going to penalize you, but it helps. It's essentially like a networking move of emailing the professor that you're interested in to introduce yourself, attach your CV, talk about what you're interested in, what interests you about their work, and say that you'll be applying to their program and that you just wanted to reach out. Caveat there, some professors say very explicitly on their website, do not do this. So if they say that, don't do it. But if they don't say that, the worst thing that happens is that they don't answer, which is often true because they're getting a lot of those emails. But it also helps them recognize your name and see, like, oh, that person was interested in me, and perhaps then pay more attention to your application. Um, so that's one that's not, of course, going to be listed anywhere. You've got to do this, but it's an unfortunate, like, political step. Letters of recommendation. You're going to be required to have 3 letters of recommendation. You want at least one of those, probably 2 of those, to be from a professor who you've worked with. Mine, for example, one of them was from the lab that I worked in before grad school. And they wrote about my research experience and recommending me based on that RA-ship. And then I had 2 from where I went to undergrad, where one was my thesis advisor. So she had worked with me in both a class and research capacity. And one I had worked with in a more teaching type capacity. Not, you don't need to have teaching experience. That was just I was picking people who knew me well and knew my work well. And so you really want to make sure that somebody can write you a strong letter because um, if they'll write you a letter, but they don't really know you or they don't really know what to say, then that's going to come across as actually kind of worse than just not having that letter at all. So think about your professors, think about your relationships with your professors, think about forming relationships. Doesn't have to be like your besties with your professor, but forming a working relationship can be really helpful to get those recommendations. Personal statement, I will talk about more in the next slide, but it's effectively a statement of interest. So it's almost similar to like your Common App essay, but not quite. But It's really going to talk about like what you're interested in and why you're interested in that school. Your CV, sorry if you already know this stuff, but your CV is basically the academic version of a resume. And so there are more things that go into it. It doesn't have to be limited to 1 or 2 pages. You want to highlight, especially for a clinical PhD, you want to really highlight your research experiences and sell yourself on what you have done and what you have learned and what those tasks have been. And if you have any publications, any posters, any sort of work like that you've done, you really want to highlight. And any awards or things that you've won, also good. I have the GRE as a question mark because it's since the pandemic happened. It's been required at some places and not required at other places. And some places it's optional but suggested. In some places it's totally optional. Um, I might recommend if your GPA is an area that you're potentially concerned about, and you're a good test taker, then taking the GRE can be useful, just to help show that have another sort of like number stat. It's honestly less looked at. I think as we know the pandemic highlighted essentially the inequities around a lot of different things, but you might have to take it, you might not, long story short. And then, so after you submit those applications, professors will start extending interview invitations. Those are still mostly virtual, again, from the pandemic at this point. Those are usually in January and February. Um, some professors will have you do preliminary interviews first, which is just a brief, like 20-minute conversation with them. And then they call their list more and decide who to invite to the full interview day. And the full interview days are what it sounds like of you're interviewing with several professors, you're interviewing with graduate students, you get opportunities to ask questions. They should also be trying to sell you on their program of why, if you get an offer, you should go there. And it's really just a fuller opportunity for you to express why you want this career, why you want that school, why you want that lab, and also have them tell you why should you want them. Okay. Speeding. I'm being too speedy. Okay. The personal statement. So I wanted to highlight this because I think it can be kind of vague and overwhelming of oftentimes all it will say on the personal statement is write a personal statement in however many words. And that I think can sometimes come across as, okay, that is like the Common App or something like that. It's the difference is you want it to be a much more professional version of the Common App. Some people's reasoning behind what led to their interest in clinical psychology is perhaps their own experiences with the mental health system, families' experiences, personal afflictions, essentially. Um, and you don't want to do that because oftentimes professors, whether or not it should be this way, I won't speak on, but they often see that as unprofessional if you're disclosing your own mental health situations or your family's mental health situations and saying that that's why you're interested. So thinking about some of the other experiences you've had to highlight that have led to your interests. So, for example, with mine, I wrote about being like doing research in one of my classes in college that showed me that I could do research that was on things like friendship because I would never have known that that was an option before I learned about that. Um, I talked about some of the clinical type experiences that I had had of like in my undergrad, I was an RA and that version was effectively being a peer counselor for a floor. And that was, so I talked about that experience. And I talked about things like, here's all the research I've done, that is what it's taught me. here's how this experience has led me to have this interest. And you really want to be sure you're selling yourself because it can feel, and that can feel weird. I remember feeling very strange being like, but I don't know if I'm really this good. You are. And so you want to sell yourself based on the skills that you have and what you can do. If you've sought out opportunities that are different than perhaps most people have, or it took like a lot of work or things for you to do, sell that, highlight that, show people that you are hardworking, that you've gone above and beyond, that you are committed to this field, and that you've all it takes to be very accomplished. You also want to highlight why, and this is going to be more similar to your undergraduate application essays. Why did you pick this program? And really, why did you pick this advisor that you're applying to? So it should be semi-clear as you're talking about your research experiences, but then you want to be very specific in highlighting of what it is about that lab, what that work is that's interesting, why you want to work there. I was also given tips when I was writing of highlighting a second professor, not that you want to work with as a PI, but to show that you've researched their faculty. I don't know that that's required, but I do know that people commented on it in my interview with them of like, oh, you said that you'd be interested in learning from me. So I think it doesn't, I think it helps more than it would hurt. Um, I also, and this again, I can't say that you have to do this because I don't know that you do. I scoured handbooks for these programs and found things that seemed unique to the program and said, I am so excited for X specific thing, this brown bag that exists at your institution. Really just to show that I had done my homework. But again, I don't know that that is a requirement. The requirements are really just tell a clear story and highlight how good you are. Okay. Let me just check. I think that's all the things on there. Um, yeah, and then I didn't make a slide on this, but and when you have offers, that's when you can start. Well, one, don't be discouraged if you don't get in on your first time because it often takes people more, at least more than once. Sometimes it takes people 3 times applying before they get into a program because they're quite competitive. But don't let that scare you. So it doesn't mean that you're a bad applicant. It doesn't mean you haven't done all the things you're supposed to do. Odds are you really have, and it's just wildly competitive. Um, Also, think about if you only get one offer, that's still amazing. I only got one offer and I am enjoying my life and I am doing what I want to be doing. So, and I'm at the time I was like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Only one person wanted me, but all you need is one. And that is truly what matters. And I think just making the most of thinking about if you do have multiple offers, good for you, great job thinking about where, then you can start thinking about like what's setting you up well, where has good internship match rates. So what I was talking about at the beginning of how I'm on internship, you want to pick a program where people have a generally 100% chance or like 95+% match rate. Because what you don't want to happen is you go through 5 years of research training and clinical training, and then you apply to internship, and then you don't match, and then you have to take an extra year and do it all again. So you want to find a place that generally has that. And also it can be helpful to look at licensure rates in that, especially if that's important to you to get at least have clinical options with your career. If the folks are not passing the licensure exam, then that to me is a bit of a red flag about a program. But it doesn't need to be your top marker, just things to consider if as you're weighing programs. But okay. I went through that speedily. Questions, comments, concerns. Floor is open to anybody.
Hi, I had a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, so like I know that we can like send cold emails, but like in order to send the email, like don't we need to be accepted into the PhD program first?
Good question. No, you don't. That's the thing there where you have to like know the politics basically of you can send those emails just telling them you are applying, basically to introduce yourself and say, hello, I'm applying. So I emailed like 18, 20 professors during my post-bac year saying, I'm applying, or are you taking students? Um, you can usually find their email addresses on their like faculty profiles on their website. Is that helpful, or is there more to
Oh
that?
yeah, okay, that's good to know. So like we can just send emails without getting accepted.
Yep,
So
yep,
we basically like, for example, if I want to apply to UCLA, I can look up the psychology professors that work at UCLA and send them emails.
yes, you sure can.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hmm.
Let's see.
Um, I see there's questions in the chat, but
Yeah,
first, yes, I s-
I think Yanisa was Yanisa, yeah, go for
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a question regarding how a clinical psychology PhD application may differ from more general psychology PhD applications.
That is a good question. They're pretty similar, honestly. Like for any PhD program, usually the question is going to be tell us a research statement, talk about what you are interested in researching. It's applying to a clinical PhD is effectively the same as applying to any PhD. You just also want to like weave in pieces of why did you pick clinical versus something else? Of like, why do you also want to do some work, some clinical work with humans, as opposed to just doing a research degree? But otherwise, I applied to one or two developmental programs, and the process was exactly the same. Uh,
I
You mentioned that it's important to like build working relationships with professors to get letters of rec. How do you recommend like building that relationship?
yeah, it's a good question. And I'll also defer slightly to you all know how your university works better than mine than I do. But things like going to office hours, which I know is very stereotypical to say, working in a research lab in undergrad if you're able to, um, talking with professors about your interests, asking them questions, essentially asking for some advice or mentorship as opposed to just being a face in the class. Well, Um, so you can really talk to, sorry, I've got a chat. Okay, sorry. Um, Essentially going out of your way to talk to people, and treat them as like humans as opposed to, I think sometimes we can view professors as like this monolith of, oh, they're my teacher, they're authority figures. I can't just go chit chat them up. A lot of times, especially psychology professors, I think are pretty open to chatting and they want to talk about research and they want to talk about their path and they want to help students. And so if they don't want that, then that tells you perhaps that's not a great professor to form a relationship with. But otherwise, really just pursuing them. Um, okay, I'm looking at the chat. Can I talk a little bit more about why societies are controversial? Societies are controversial because of elitism, essentially, within the field and within academia. Um, oh, cool. So some societies, some people out there in the world view PhDs as like the ultimate degree, and that's the best training you can ever get, and they're superior to any other level of clinician, which like not really true. There is a ton of training, but PsyDs can be just as good. You can get just as much clinical training. I think there is just a reputation of because some of them cost so much money that some of them are not necessarily worth the cost. And there are more programs out there of how I was talking about, like the licensure rates and the match rates. For some PsyD programs, they take really, really big classes, and then a lot of them don't match. So that is just a thing to be careful of as you're doing your research. It's not an indictment against societies as a whole. It's just being like doing your research on figuring out where you're applying. Um, okay. How did I find a lab to work on in undergrad? So I will say I went to a small liberal arts college, so my experience was, I think, pretty different to probably what yours is at UCSC. In my undergrad, there weren't really labs, but I had formed a relationship with a professor who I liked her research in a class, and so I met with her and I talked with her about one of the papers that we had written and things that we had read, and I was like, "Oh, what about this idea?" And she was really open to it. And then we didn't have senior theses options, but basically I was then proposing of like, can I do this as a thesis? Can I work with you? And she was really open to it. As far as since you are at a bigger university, you can look more on faculty pages, and sometimes those faculty pages will have like links to their lab page, and then you can find out some information on what they're researching, what they're doing, if they're taking research assistants, um, or just at UCSC. I mean, I'm hoping that the professors are kind to you there. But I think just sometimes taking a risk and sending an email and saying, I'm really interested in this XYZ research. Do you have any openings in your lab, or do you have time to talk about it? Can we schedule a meeting? Just worst they can say is no, and they probably won't say no. Okay, I see a hand up, and then I'll go back to chat.
Yeah, Micah, do you want to go for it?
I think the questions in the chat might have came first if you wanted to do
Okay,
this.
sure. Yes, sorry, let me look here. Where do I suggest starting your journey to exploring a career if you don't plan to do grad school right away? It's a good question. I think you can think of one what the parts you're less sure about are. If it's research, then getting a research assistant position or volunteering in a lab is a great place to start just to see if that's something that you would even like doing. Clinically, sometimes there are, people volunteer for like crisis helplines, they volunteer for like student mental health organizations that are on campus, they volunteer at crisis centers, they get a sense whether that's the type of work they like to do. And so starting in either one of basically like starting very basic entry level on either pathway or either portion of what I consider the degree is, I think, a good place to start. And I think it makes sense not to go to grad school right away. For context, when I was an undergrad, there was no way I was ready for grad school right afterward. I needed to figure out more of who I was and what I wanted to do. And so that's totally fine. Um, and then another one in the chat, if you didn't create strong relationships with professors, I think you at least just need someone who knows your work and can write to your work. It doesn't have to be like they know you super perfectly well as a person, but somebody who you did well in their class, ideally. So they at least can speak to you did good work with them, you did this, that, and the other. And then if you're doing some of these other volunteer opportunities to try to figure out what you want to do, forming relationships with those bosses to get recommendations from them, I think can be quite useful. Okay. Now I think go for hand up.
Micah, you can go for it if you want.
Thank you. Um, so one question I had was how significant a senior thesis is if you're involved in multiple labs and you have a lot of research experience. And in the labs you do have your projects where you're more heavily involved and this kind of already demonstrates that you know how to run research yourself. 'Cause I've been told that that's kind of the main purpose of a senior thesis is to show that you can do research on your own.
Yes,
So I'm
that's
kind of
correct.
wondering if you're doing research on your own in a capacity in your research labs as an undergraduate, do you really need to do a senior thesis?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you're right in that the purpose for a lot of people, a senior thesis is their main chance to show those research skills that you're talking about, of that they can run a study, that they can write it up, that they could present it. Um, and so it's definitely more important for people who don't really have quite as much integral lab experience. It never hurts, but if what you're saying is like you're getting authorship on papers, you're doing posters, you're doing like more of the research heavy academic things, then that is probably going to matter more than a senior thesis.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Kiara, I think you were next.
Hi, I just had kind of a quick question because I know you mentioned at the beginning that you didn't feel like a paid PhD program was really worth it, but I know that a lot of funded clinical psychology PhD programs can be like extremely competitive, and like you said, people spend like years and years applying, and I was just wondering, even though that is obviously a much more expensive option, it can be sometimes easier to get into like a PhD program at like a professional school, for example. And I was just wondering in the field if people, if it kind of matters, like whether you paid for your PhD and got it at a professional school or at like a research institution, if people kind of see them differently, is there a difference in prestige, like, kind of in the actual
Yeah, yeah.
workforce, like
Fair
does it make a
question. I'll
difference?
take a step back of I I personally in my own life would not want to pay to get a PhD, but that I cannot speak for everybody. Um, and nobody really will know if you paid to get your PhD. You'll put on your CV like where you got your graduate training, but nobody's gonna like that would be strange to me if somebody looked that up and were like, "Oh, they paid for it, not worth it." Oh, their training's probably bad. Probably they won't do that. Um, that then I think is just another consideration of if you have the finances for it or are willing to go into debt for it, then you can um have more likelihood of going for it. Again, I think the really important thing is looking at those match rates because if it's a paid program and the match rates are really low, then that suggests to me that perhaps either the training isn't as good or people are viewing the training as not as good or something is going on. But if it's a paid program and they have really good match and licensure rates, then people are accomplishing the same things and then it's just a matter of what you can afford.
And sorry, just follow-up question, like similarly, like people working in the field view like PsyDs differently from PhDs similarly? I know you said there was like kind of a sense of elitism because of the money, but and
Yeah.
I know they're less research oriented, but like for clinical work, like
For
specifically, since if
clinical
they're
work,
both.
I haven't noticed that. I think you're more likely to find some of the elitism, perhaps among more academically oriented people. And I won't speak for everybody. I here at Boston Children's, which is a very well-regarded children's hospital, work with several people with PsyDs, and they are here and they are attending psychologists. Um, I have people in my internship cohort who are getting their PsyD. People can definitely be successful with them. I think, and I think slash hope the field is getting a little bit less elitist about them. Um, there's just still it's still working, I think, its way up in some people's mind. Um,
Thank you.
Let's
for
see.
those, yeah,
I think we've got Marty in the chat and then Talia and Malia, and then I think we'll be about at time.
sounds good.
Cool.
What do I recommend for those who don't have family financial support? It's a great question. Uh, a lot of that's one where then I might recommend getting a job first and taking a few years working to try to make some money. I did that partly because I didn't have enough research experience, but also because I I didn't have money built up during undergrad. Um, so thinking about cost of living of these programs, some places, the university that you're going to will give out specific scholarships or fellowships or things like that, but that's pretty university dependent. Um, as far as I unfortunately don't actually know of specific scholarships to look out for, because mine came through the university, like Penn State specifically. Um, but I'm sure that they're out there, and I hope the advising office maybe knows more on that. Sorry, they don't have a great answer to that question. When you say master accelerated programs, what do you mean by that?
I've heard of certain master programs where you can finish them in like a year shorter, just depending on the program.
Hmm,
I just wasn't sure how much that applied to psychology or like how long on average it usually takes to get your master's in general, depending on which program you do.
got it.
So I was just curious to what you might have heard or whatnot.
Yeah. Okay, got you. I don't know of any, but also if your goal is to get into a PhD, then an accelerated one, when the purpose of probably getting the master's is to get more research experience and to make you more competitive for graduate school. I don't know that I would recommend an accelerated one because most people are going in with two to 3 years in between undergrad and PhD programs. Again, not everybody, but that is really common to take more than 1 year. And so to get and also just to have the time to get the research experience, because research is unfortunately just slow. And 1 year just often isn't enough time to get the level of work that you would need or benefit from at least.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm?
All right, Talia.
Hi, I was just wondering, and I know that well, from what you said, that you just directly went to do your PhD, but I'm wondering the difference between just applying to straight grad school versus just the whole process of applying for a PhD and how it's like different.
Yeah, so grad school encompasses a lot of different types of degrees. So it's basically like a blanket term for the same way you could say you're an undergrad, but that
Sorry,
doesn't. Hmm?
sorry, I'm in master's,
Oh,
sorry.
okay. Cool, cool, cool. Yes, a master's. Okay, wait. So the application process difference?
Yeah, I was wondering how the master's like for just straight like applying for like masters like a MFT master like
Got it.
how it's different from applying to like the like getting a
Great
PhD.
question. For full transparency, I didn't apply to any. Um, but from what I know from other people who have applied to programs like social work programs and things like that, it's still going to be like you're writing a statement of why you're interested and why you want to go to that program. It's going to probably be less about here's all of the research that you can do and that you've done and that you want to do because you don't necessarily need to sell that part quite as much. Um, it can be more of like what you want from one of those from a master's degree, what type of clinical work do you want to do? I think the application deadlines are later than they are for PhDs. Don't quote me on that. Be sure you check. But I think it's similar, just a little bit less research focused and perhaps less competitive.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Malia.
Hello. Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned it's important to have research experience and like if you're in a lab, that's pretty good. Um, is there any like particular like type of responsibilities in labs that would stand out in an application? And then also I have like another question, like what like what would make a letter of recommendation strong?
Mhm. Things that would stand out are at least getting onto a poster or doing things like that, of showing that you can be part of the actual academic product. Because a lot of the actual responsibilities are very similar from research assistant to research assistant. And people usually know of that research assistants aren't doing like super glamorous academic work, right? You're doing things like recruitment or study participation, but you can highlight things of that you've led research sessions, that you have participated in recruitment, that you have uh, learned data analysis or worked on analyzing data or things like that as part of your RA-ship. And if you had any leadership roles within your sort of lab. Um, but yeah, sometimes the like productivity is viewed even better. Okay, and then your second question, can you remind me?
Yeah, what makes a letter of recommendation
Yes, okay.
strong?
Strong is somebody who really seems like they are vouching for you, of somebody who like really is, if compare the difference of if I were writing like a recommendation for somebody and I said, this person has worked on this study and they have done really strong work. They have shown initiative in this specific thing. These are their skills. They're detail oriented. I know all these things about them. Versus if I were to recommend you someone of this person is a strong student and a hard worker. Of that still like that's not a bad thing, but somebody who is able to have like seems like they're really vouching for you is going to sound stronger than someone who basically is like, I know them and they got an A in my class.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. So we have someone in the chat, and then I think Ty had his hand raised, but I want to be mindful of your time, Becca. Um, if you want to stay longer, that's awesome, but we can certainly wrap as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer these last couple questions, and I also can put my email in the chat for
Perfect.
anybody who wishes to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm gonna put two emails in the chat because one is my internship email and one of them is my Penn State email, and I don't know which one they'll be taking away when. Um,
And I think
in the JD PhD program, I have heard of one person who was interested in that but didn't end up applying, so I unfortunately cannot really speak to what that was like. Penn State, for reference, doesn't have a JD PhD, so I don't know that well, but I would recommend if there's specific programs you're interested in, seeing if you can find any current students who attend those.
perfect. And then not sure if Ty, you had a question or not before we wrap.
Yes, thank you for squeezing me in. I wanted to go back about what you mentioned about finding experience after graduate school.
Mhm.
And you just mentioned that like a post bachelor's RA is just, the best all-round choice. But in terms of, also balancing like volunteering in a research lab being kind of
Mhm.
maybe the easiest to get into, and you mentioned masters may not be as like research focused as is ideal, especially if you want to get a PhD rather than a PsyD. Like really balancing all three of those is because I feel like I have been told previously that maybe a master's program now might even be easier than finding a post-bachelor's RA, or like is even more realistic. And so like if there was a way to do it, is that better than just volunteering, getting a master's, or like is that post-bachelor's RA really the one that you should be trying to do?
That's a there's no one answer to that. I am speaking to the experiences that I have and that I view as the most financially feasible. But I think if you're volunteering, if you are talking to a professor, I would be very explicit in asking of what types of experiences can I get when I'm volunteering? What can I actually do? What responsibilities can I be a part of? Can I get authorship on papers or posters? Because you're right, if you're just volunteering, but you're volunteering like an hour a week and not doing a ton, a master's definitely would be better than that. Um, I think my major point and takeaway in all of these things is considering what makes the most financial sense for you. Because a master's is still not a guarantee that you'll get into a PhD program. And so if you are content with that and you can afford it and you are cool with the employment opportunities afterward, then that can be totally worth it. If you really need to be earning money in this time in between going to grad school, then for me personally, I would be considering more ways of like, how can I make money and earn money?